Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Elaine Kub looks at implications of political uncertainty in Brazil. Nathan Mueller talks about growing problems for some of the Nebraska corn crop. Stephen Wegulo describes diseases in the state's winter wheat. And Ron Plain discusses U.S. pork exports to China. Elaine Kub is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. The country's farmers are maintaining a planting pace ahead of normal. Growers have planted 3/4 of this year's corn and 36% of this season's soybeans. Machines are rolling in the north, where 3 states are well ahead of their 5-year average corn planting paces by 29 points in Minnesota and Wisconsin and 33 points in North Dakota. Those rates do not carry to Nebraska, as we'll discuss in a few minutes. We talked with Elaine Wednesday afternoon about crude oil's market rally, strength in corn prices, and planting progress in her area of South Dakota.
Well, it's slow. I think the concerns here pale in comparison to the concerns in the eastern corn belt. When you look at, the Monday crop progress numbers, that's really where they're way behind on corn and way behind in soybeans, and it's all because of the wet weather, which even folks in the western corn belt are familiar with, obviously, and struggling with to some degree this season. However, I want to say it's the middle of May, and you already hear people worrying about switching to soybean acres, and I think it's way too early to worry about that. I mean, we're taping this on May 18th. May 15th is usually when the academic studies start to say that you might get a yield loss, but you never really know what the summer weather will be. We don't know that the late planted corn won't actually benefit from it. So at this point, I'm not too worried about a change in acreage yet.
So soybeans got the headlines last week after the supply and demand estimates, but corn has put together a nice little baby rally here. Diagnose for me what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, if you look sort of in this post-planting intentions time frame, so since April 1st, it's gone up more than 50 cents the nearby contract has. So this is nothing to sneeze at. This is some really good opportunities for folks. I think it is mostly following the soybean story and to some extent following the story from South America, or just the demand story that the U.S. from an exports perspective definitely does benefit when there is tightness or unavailability or even political instability in Brazil or elsewhere.
Right, and you kind of got all of the above going in Brazil right now, but what about the currency down in Brazil? How is that impacting what could be happening in the U.S.?
That is, I think, probably the #1 leader of this soybean rally, and like I said, I think that the soybean rally is what's also leading the corn rally. So in the U.S., the dollar and our soybean prices move in opposite directions, but in Brazil, the Brazilian real tends to move in the same time or in the same direction as the international soybean prices. So as that currency goes up, international Chicago soybean prices also go up. So it's wonderful news right now that there has been sort of this optimism that a change in political leadership there could help their economy and help their currency. Now, this week we have seen the real sort of stabilize or stall and kind of back off to about 28 US cents on the dollar. And because, it's not magic, right? So Dilma Rousseff has been suspended, but obviously we don't have suddenly magic, wonderful economic things happening there immediately. So there's a little bit of a reckoning with reality.
And even if that impeachment were to happen, Elaine, correct me if I'm wrong, there's still some uncertainty about overall how that would impact the real and corn and soybean markets, exports, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no reason to believe that this is going to fundamentally change the global balance of how much grain there is or where it will be going. So it's nowhere near the sort of change that happened in Argentina politically, where you really are changing some tariffs and changing some actual, like I mentioned, the balances of what goes where. Here, it's really just a play of the currency and of the overall stability there.
All right, let's go back to the U.S. here. Tell me what's happening right now in the U.S. wheat market.
Not a whole lot. I mean, this week they have followed soybeans and corn up a little bit, but really wheat is going to have a hard time making a bullish argument right now because of this long-standing story of very ample global supplies of wheat.
The U.S. crude oil market has a nice little rally going this week, at least as we talk on Wednesday. What's behind it?
A lot of things, a lot of global things, supply disruptions in Africa, in Canada, even from these wildfires. So there's the idea that this rally could continue toward that $50 level. And what is exciting about it is how that may or may not affect the ethanol market. We're seeing some more excitement coming into the RIN trading. Those are 80, 90 cents going into the summer. So going into the summer driving season, there is the possibility that the corn market, or at least the ethanol market, can take advantage of a continued rally in crude oil prices.
In corn and soybeans, what are you seeing in basis right now?
You know, it seems weak to me. The national average corn basis is 35 cents under, I think, and it's really hard to say what it should be in May. You know, there's no hard and fast rule of what a seasonal tendency should be, but that does seem a little weaker than you would expect this time of year. And soybeans also 60 under kind of processor bids. That seems quite weak too, and I suspect that that's a reflection of farmer movement. You know, we saw these incredible rallies, or really pleasant rallies in my opinion, from a farmer perspective, and I think the farmers are rewarding the markets by actually moving that grain now.
Let's talk more about that. Is this still an opportunity that you should be moving new crop soybeans?
Yes. So, I mean, I want to hedge that a little bit, that a couple of months ago, you know, I did these statistical studies of what time of year would you most likely see the high in sort of a normal supply year. And the date I calculated was June 18th, I think, for corn. So watching the market churn higher here has been rather validating, and it gives me to think that it might continue, you know, into this sort of seasonal time frame. But that being said, these are, you know, we really need to be thinking about getting seasonal sales done in a fairly normal manner. And April, May, June, this is the right time frame to be making little incremental sales, not trying to wait for exactly the high, but to make sure that you're rewarding the market as it is churning higher.
And is that in both soybeans and corn, Elaine?
Yeah, absolutely. Probably more urgent for the soybeans than the corn when you look at the price ratio. The price ratio of new crop soybeans to corn is 2.6 to 1 right now. So that suggests that soybeans are a little overpriced, you know, for all of the reasons that they've been leading the market. But that would, you know, if that's going to snap back down to its historical average, it would be more urgent to sell the soybeans than the corn in the near term.
Later in the show, we'll look at hog markets with Ron Plain. Next week, Roy Smith will give us his thoughts on corn and soybean markets. The National Academy of Sciences said this week after extensive research it found no evidence indicating genetically engineered foods pose a higher risk to human health safety than non-GE foods. The Academy reached that result after comparing more than 20 years of data from the U.S. and Canada, where GMOs are commonplace, to the United Kingdom and Western Europe, where GMOs are not widely consumed. The findings point to a smaller use of herbicides since the inception of GMO crops, but also increased resistance issues in weeds and insects. The report says no conclusive evidence exists, however, proving a direct impact between those crops and environmental problems, such as the reduction of monarch butterflies. In many cases, researchers point to the need for more monitoring of GE use. Congress created the Academy in 1863 for the purpose of providing objective information on sciences to the U.S. Difficult weather conditions have aided in a slow pace of planting across Nebraska. The state's farmers are 7 points behind their average corn planting pace and 14 points off in soybeans. 30% of the corn crop has emerged, but that's 5 points slower than normal. As discussed in a recent Crop Watch article, some stands and plants above ground are less than ideal, leading to questions about replanting. Earlier this week, we talked with Nebraska Extension's Nathan Mueller near Fremont to learn more about issues growers may be facing. We started by asking about some of the fields in his area of eastern Nebraska.
Yesterday, just conducted the first crop tour of Dodge and Washington County. Drove about 180 miles, stopped at 25 fields. With all the wetness we've had, April was the third wettest April in 123 years in Fremont after 1944 and 1984. So it's wet. It's wet like last year. So farmers, got an early start in April, about April 12th to April 17th. A lot of corn went in, and those are also some of the cornfields that we're seeing some issues with in terms of stand.
Yeah, let's talk about stand. They're coming from two things you said. One is planting into dry soils, and then it got cold, and one is planting into wet soils, and it got wetter.
Yeah, so two conditions on the well-drained fields up in most of the rest of the county. It was really dry. We didn't have any moisture from the first part of April, and so it went in the dry soil, and parts of the field was really dry, maybe where they worked it. That seed sat there for a couple days, and then around April 19th, we got some cold, wet weather, as 40s and 50s with some rain. And when corn seed first absorbs water or imbibes water, it needs to be warm water, not cold. And so we had some chilling injury on that corn. So we did have some stand issues across the field. I already made some field visits. In most of those cases, it was best for the farmer to keep what they had. The other situation is here in the Platte River Valley, Elkhorn, and Missouri River bottom, is we just, with all that moisture, that early corn, just had over 10 inches of rain on it. And so in poorly drained areas of the field, we're looking at some conditions where we're going to probably need to replant.
If you're trying to decide whether or not to replant, what are some things you should take in consideration?
Yeah, the first thing to do is get a good average plant population across the field. So it might be 10 locations across the field, 2 adjacent rows, average that. But in those same areas, you need to look at what the gaps are. Is there 2 to 3 foot gaps, or are there 4 to 6 foot gaps? And then how many potential plants are going to may emerge yet. Now we're late enough now, the plants that haven't come up aren't, but last week we were still assessing if some additional plants will come up. So those are the 3 things you need to make a note of when you scout the field. So once you have that, you're going to look at a replant yield potential. And Iowa State is a table we use. We're so close to Iowa. And so you're going to look at what's the maximum yield potential I have on my initial planting at the current stand and the gaps in the rows compared to my replant yield potential. In a lot of cases in the 2 fields I visited last week, we were looking at that chilling injury. It was better for them to keep what they had. Even at 19 to 20,000 plants with some gaps, they were still ahead on yield potential over replanting now.
Is there a decision to make about if it's too late to plant corn?
Yeah, so like on these fields, the field we're here in today in the Platte River bottom, where the stand that we lost was due to wet conditions mostly. We've had 11 inches of rain or more. It was the wettest April on record, the 3rd wettest April on record. And so we're looking at today, we still have some time before May 25th, and May 25th is the start of the replant period for corn. So every day after May 25th through June 14th, we lose 1% of our guaranteed yield in terms of crop insurance. So typically that we're still going to look at replanting corn in most of those situations through the end of May. Into June, we're going to look at probably changing the maturity of our hybrid a little bit, and also the idea of planting soybeans back to fields we can, depending on what we had for herbicide.
In some of the cornfields that are up right now, are you noticing any damping off problems?
Yeah, so a lot of these fields where we already had a lot of wetness, we already lost the stand, several of the fields, especially corn on cornfields in river valleys, under irrigation actually, where I saw damping off. And so when you're walking across the field, you might have a healthy plant, and right next to it looks kind of like a slightly wilted plant. You dig that up, and below ground you're seeing that hypocotyl is rotted. And so that's something to watch. There's not much we can do about it, but it's something just to watch, because you need to take into account maybe you're losing some more plants yet.
And finally, that yellow corn that you might notice out there?
Yeah, there's a lot of yellow corn across the area, and that's just due to the cold temperatures we have. Once things warm up, we start to mineralize nitrogen. The plants will start to green up, and I've already started to notice some corn starting to green up already.
You can find more about Nathan's recent crop tour of Dodge and Washington counties online at croptechcafe.org. You can also find a recent article on keeping or replanting corn through a link on the Market Journal website. The status of Nebraska's winter wheat improved slightly over the last week. The latest USDA crop progress report shows the percent of the crop in good to excellent condition 1 point better than a week ago. 34% is listed as heading, well ahead of the state's 5-year average of 17%. But there are problems emerging. We talked with Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Stephen Wegulo Wednesday morning to learn more about the shape of this state's crop.
The wheat is in actually very good condition. Last week it was rated up to 67% good to excellent, so it's in very good shape.
What are the disease problems that you're seeing in areas of the state?
Well, stripe rust continues to be a concern throughout the state. So that's one disease that growers should be keeping watch on. In Kansas, those growers that did not spray, their fields have very severe stripe rust right now. And Kansas is a little bit ahead of us. So we still have conditions favorable for stripe rust to cause significant damage if wheat is not sprayed.
Yeah, is there a management option? What is it?
Well, right now, if you are in the western half of the state, probably you want to time the flag leaf because the wheat is not fully headed there. If you are in the eastern half of the state, wheat is headed or flowering, and the other concern we have is fusarium head blight. And you remember from last year we had some very bad fusarium head blight. So if wheat is headed and starting to flower, we recommend that you apply Caramba or Prosaro. Those two fungicides are good in suppressing fusarium head blight, and they're excellent in controlling rust and other fungal diseases.
Are there any virus problems?
There are two virus diseases that we are seeing right now, and one is barley yellow dwarf virus. It causes the leaves to yellow, and right now mostly the flag leaves. You'll see the flag leaf is yellow from the tip down, and so we are seeing it at low to moderate levels. It's a little higher in varieties that are more susceptible. And the other virus we are seeing, and mostly in the panhandle of Nebraska, is wheat streak mosaic virus. Some fields in the panhandle have very severe wheat streak mosaic virus. Now, with viruses, there's nothing you can do once they occur, but there are some things you can do later in the after harvest to help limit the damage the following year. So, for example, with wheat streak mosaic, you control volunteer wheat and any volunteer grassy weeds that are in the field, because the volunteer wheat and grassy weeds, they support the wheat curl mite and as well as the virus. And if you don't control those two, we call them the green bridge. If you don't control the green bridge, then those mites will move on to the fall planted wheat later in the fall and transmit wheat streak mosaic. So you can do some things to help with virus control the following year, but this year it's too late.
At what level could those virus problems start to impact yield?
Well, wheat streak mosaic in general in the Great Plains causes 2 to 3% yield loss, but in specific fields we have seen 100% loss. So if you don't control that volunteer wheat and you have a severe case of wheat streak mosaic, you could lose up to 100% of your wheat.
You can find more about wheat diseases on the CropWatch website. We'll also link to those resources on the Market Journal homepage. The Maine Nebraska farmer says subsurface drainage is gaining traction in Nebraska, especially in places like Dodge, Washington, and Burke counties, where wet springs have combined with poorly drained soils. This month's issue says farmers like Jay Euling, who farms in Dodge and Burke counties, have been borrowing from the playbooks of growers in states to the east by installing subsurface systems. You can read more about how those drainage methods work in the Maine Nebraska Farmer. We also have a look this week at hog markets with University of Missouri's Ron Plain. U.S. pork exports have started the year strong, and Ron says a big part of the credit goes to Asia. Shipments to China and Hong Kong during the first quarter were up 164% from the first quarter of 2015. Exports to Japan, the second largest destination behind Mexico for the time period, were up 14%. We talked with Ron Tuesday afternoon about foreign demand, feed prices for U.S. producers, and market prices over the last few weeks.
We're doing well, Jeff. Prices have moved steadily higher for the last month or so. Seasonally, that tends to happen this time of year. We're looking at prices for bears and gilts in the terminal markets on a live weight basis in the high 40s, and carcass prices for plant delivered to hogs around $74 per hundredweight.
What have producers experienced for per head profit margins?
Well, so far it's kind of typical. We lost some money late last year and the start of this year, but April profits came in around $9 per head, and the outlook is that that should improve. Normally the best profits come during the summer months.
Yeah, what impacts profitability here for those producers over the rest of 2016?
Well, corn prices, of course, the big cost of raising hogs is feed, 60–65% typically. So good summer weather and a good corn crop. USDA says we might have a record corn harvest this fall. If so, that's going to keep down production costs. And then, of course, hog prices is the single biggest, most important thing. Expectation is that carcass prices will move higher this summer and fairly strong yet this fall. So the outlook is that we might make a little bit more money this year than we did last year.
I should ask about pork production overall. What are the estimates as to how much we'll churn out for the rest of this year?
Well, USDA is forecasting about 2% more pork this year than last year, and then a 2.6% increase next year. That's a little bit faster than long-term trend, but if we do have another record corn crop and low feed costs, that may stimulate production. And the other thing, we've got some new slaughter plants coming online, and certainly it's going to take hogs to operate those plants.
Let's talk about pork exports. In the first quarter, they're up 5% from a year ago. Where's that increase in demand coming from?
Mostly Asia. China, Hong Kong, Japan are the three big growth areas for U.S. pork exports thus far this year. We didn't do all that well in exporting to Japan last year, so it's kind of a rebound there. China is something of a hit-and-miss location. Right now, their pork production is down, and they're importing more pork, and that's good news for U.S. hog farms.
How does that go in China between the U.S. and the European Union as far as trying to gain market share in that nation?
The European Union did very well last year. They gained a lot of market share in the Asian market, particularly the Chinese market, and a lot of that has to do with exchange rates. The dollar has been strong against the euro. A strong dollar makes U.S. products expensive for foreigners, and the weaker euro has made European pork more competitive in places like China and Japan.
How do you think the dollar will move over the near term?
Well, so far this year, the trend is encouraging. We're down about 5 to 10% in value of the dollar from the peak at the start of the year. Hopefully we can see that soften a bit more. That will be very good for all U.S. exporters, and agriculture is a big export industry, so hopefully a bit weaker as we move on through 2016.
Okay, finally, how do you believe market prices will move here as we enter summer?
Well, seasonally, you can usually count on the high price for the year sometime in early summer. We probably got another month or so of higher prices. Once you get to Labor Day, prices normally start to decline. Right now, we're expecting probably a little bit higher prices in the fourth quarter of this year than we had last year. So it's shaping up to be a pretty good year here in 2016.
Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension Associate State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. Of course, I've been gone the past 2 weeks, and during this last 2 weeks, we have had a couple of rounds of severe weather move through the state. And during this last week, of course, we had some precipitation that was widespread across the southern two-thirds of the state during the Tuesday time frame, with the heaviest precipitation totals the closer you got to the Kansas border. Now, as we go through this upcoming week, there are several opportunities for precipitation, which will increase as we move through the week, as we see another low move into the southwestern United States. The good news is some for the people to the east of us, where the very cold air has been set in for the better part of the last couple of weeks. With the return to this troughing action of the western United States, we're going to actually start to see some warmth build into the eastern Corn Belt, which has been unusually cold, running anywhere from 15 to 20 degrees below normal over this later part of the last week, especially over the upper Great Lakes region. So overall, it looks to be an improving picture in the eastern portions of the Corn Belt. For the western Corn Belt, once this upper air low moves into our region, it looks like it would be very soggy, particularly as we get to the later part of the week. So let's take a look and see how the daily factors are going to play into this situation. And here we have what's remains of some troughing action that moved through earlier this week in the eastern Corn Belt. very little precipitation expected with this, but the main action, of course, is to our west. So we have a large trough digging all the way into the southwestern United States, and this is going to be a slow progressor as we move eastward, as we have this blocking high pressure in place. So we're expecting very nice conditions today and nice warm conditions with the southwest flow at the surface. Now, as we go into tomorrow, we'll see this trough trying to make a little bit of progress into western Nebraska. So the best opportunity would be late afternoon shower development and isolated more in nature toward eastern Nebraska. But as we get into Monday, we start to see that first trough kind of wash out, and the remnants of that will be situated over eastern Nebraska, and that's where we expect to see any isolated shower activity to develop. And as we go into Tuesday, what we're going to notice is a reinforcing trough starting to rebuild back in. That's going to inject more energy out of the southwest, so we'll get a brief reprieve on Tuesday across eastern Nebraska, maybe an isolated shower across western Nebraska, but overall a fairly warm trend. And as we go into Wednesday, now this trough starts to dig back in. We start to pull a little Gulf moisture into the region, so we'll start to see an increasing probability of precipitation across western Nebraska, and some of that translating eastward during the overnight hours. But more importantly, as we get into Thursday, this is when the main trough is expected to start moving out. I would expect to see a severe weather outbreak across the Texas Panhandle, western Kansas, and possibly even into southwest Nebraska as the system starts to lift toward the northeast. And we'll see the generation of the shower and thunderstorm activity spread upwards into eastern Nebraska as we go through the overnight hours, and particularly into Friday, where the upper air low starts to spin to the south of us and generates the activity in eastern Nebraska. And we have to pay attention, depending on where this low moves out, will really dictate who gets the worst of the severe weather. And in fact, if we get enough severe weather built up in southern Kansas and eastern Oklahoma, it may rob some of that moisture moving toward the north. And as we look at the 8 to 14 day forecast, of course, that trough kind of peters out somewhat. So we see the warm temperatures remain in the eastern United States with the ridging pattern. And as we look at the precipitation, widespread precipitation, although as the system moves eastward, there are signs that it's going to weaken somewhat. And so the precipitation across the eastern Corn Belt may not nearly be as significant. So for us, overall, it looks like it's going to be a fairly pleasant week through the midweek period with just slight chances of shower activity. And then the precipitation ramps up dramatically as we go into this weekend for yet another very wet weekend ahead, as it's been a pattern off and on now for the better part of the last 2 months.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean prices, stand problems in corn, winter wheat diseases, and pork exports. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Next week, Roy Smith will be our market analyst. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.